Good afternoon, everyone. I know there are still a few folks in line getting their lunch, but we are going to go ahead and get started in deference to time. First of all, welcome to all of you who are joining us on our Thursday snowy lunch at the library. Congratulations to all of you for making it here. I will be honest, we were having discussions into the evening last night about whether this program, yeah, Brenna's laughing in the back because she was the other one having the discussion with me, about whether this program should move forward, and I'm so very glad that we did. What this tells me is that, number one, you are stalwart supporters of the American Philosophical Society, and number two, you are bored out of your mind sitting at home. Am I right? Good. All right, so let me go ahead and start as we start all of our programs here at the APS with a land acknowledgement. I should introduce myself, sorry. My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the director of the library and museum here. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. I wanted to give you just a brief introduction to the American Philosophical Society, since I know that we are largely among friends today. But we were founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin as North America's first learned society. I usually include this snippet from our founding document, in which Franklin says that the first drudgery of settling the colonies, which confines the attention of people to mere necessities, is pretty well over, which I always think is very optimistic in 1743. We had a lot of work to do. Indeed, I would suggest we still do in thinking about our founding principles and where we're going. The APS today is a vibrant organization. We have an elected membership of scholars from around the world, including 100 Nobel laureates. These members meet twice a year in April and in November. But we also have a variety of ways in which we reach different audiences. We have academic conferences throughout the year. Our next one is coming up in June and is already posted on our website. And we have dozens of special events and lectures like the one that you are attending today. We also have a press, the longest running continuous press in North America, and our press director is here, Kim Gwinta. We also have a range of research grants and prizes, and I know that our director for grants and research is here as well, Linda, if you want to raise your hand. If you want to know any more about these opportunities, please see them after the presentation. In the library, which is where I call home, we have over 14 million pages of manuscripts, more than 325,000 volumes, the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, and over 300,000 digital objects, as well as over 3,300 museum objects. These are the province of our 4 scholarly centers, which focus 3 of them on our areas of collecting and interest: early American history, the history of science, and Native American and Indigenous studies. Our 4th center, the Center for Digital Scholarship, supports the other 3 and helps advance our work in many ways, online and to virtual audiences. Now you might be asking, how do we do it? And the answer is through the support of friends like you. So if you are not already a friend of the American Philosophical Society, I do encourage you to consider becoming one. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Travis Glasson is a historian of Britain, the British Empire, and the transatlantic world. He is the Associate Professor of History at Temple University and is an affiliated faculty member in Temple's Global Studies program. He completed both his MA and his PhD at Columbia University and his BA at the College of the Holy Cross. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and has received grants and fellowships from institutions including the John Carter Brown Library, the Huntington Library, the Harvard University Atlantic Seminar, the American Historical Association, and the Center for Humanities at Temple. Glasson's first book, Mastering Christianity, Missionary Anglicism and Slavery in the Atlantic World, which was published by Oxford in 2012, analyzed the efforts of 18th century church and English missionaries to convert enslaved and free Black people to Christianity in colonial America, the Caribbean, and West Africa. His other publications include book chapters and articles in journals including the William and Mary Quarterly and the Journal of British Studies. But today, his talk, which is sponsored by the APS's David Center for the American Revolution, will be about his new book, Nobody Men: Neutrality, Loyalties, and Family in the American Revolution, which came out with Yale University Press in 2025, and I should add, is available for sale in the back of the room following this presentation. In it, he considers the wider history of neutrality through the experiences of the extended Kruger family, a New York-based merchant clan. Please join me in welcoming Travis to the podium.
Hi, thank you, Michelle. So thank you to the APS, to the David Center for the American Revolution for this chance to share my work with you. Specifically, my thanks to Brenna Holland, Brendan McConville, Michelle McDonald, and Thomas Johns for inviting me into making all this happen. And thank you to all of you for braving the cold. Those of you who are here in person, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming out. And to those of us joining online, thanks so much. So, let me start with the way that I start my book. In May 1779, as the War of the American Revolution limped into a fifth year, a Pennsylvania newspaper printed a letter from a patriot partisan who wrote under the pen name of Brahmin. Philadelphia readers of Brahmin's letter had recently been through tempestuous times. The Declaration of Independence had, of course, been enacted and signed in the city in the summer of 1776, but British military offensives in the Declaration's aftermath had made securing independence seem very unlikely at various moments since then. The British Army had descended on Philadelphia in September 1777 and occupied it for 9 months, withdrawing only in June 1778. While the British had spent the winter of 1778 secure and comparatively comfortable here in Philadelphia, the Continental Army had been suffering in Valley Forge, and Congress had been forced to flee. Many Philadelphians had, in one way or another, and with widely varying degrees of enthusiasm, accommodated themselves to the British occupation during these dark days for the Patriot cause. Now, though, as Brahmin wrote in the spring of 1779, the tides of war had shifted. The British were relying on a new Southern strategy to win the war. Philadelphia was back under Patriot control, and partisans of independence like Brahmin were looking to press home what they saw as an opportunity. Brahmin's letter was revealingly addressed to messieurs, the Tory men, moderate men, anybody's men, everybody's men, nobody's men, the trimmers, temporizers, etc., 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 wherever dispersed throughout the 13 United States of America. In what might be read as advice, or I think more likely a threat, Brahmin urged all these people that their only safety now lay in embracing the revolution. It was a long and relentlessly pejorative list of names. It's a list that identifies the difficulty of capturing and categorizing the people that the book that I'm here to speak about is on, those in the middle in the American Revolution, and it shows that they were a complex and varied group. Brahmin's letter also signals the long-term problems that the presence of people in the middle posed for ultras on both sides. Those in the middle were very numerous. A classic formulation offered at various times and places by John Adams is that they constituted approximately 1/3 of the wartime American population. Recent reasonable estimates by historians suggest that neutrals may have accounted for perhaps 40 to 60% of the total colonial population during the revolutionary conflict. Nevertheless, scholars have largely ignored those in the middle and concentrated on small minorities of the most polarized and radical populations in the future United States, militant patriots and loyalists, when writing about the revolution. My book, in contrast, puts neutrals at the center of a history of the American Revolution. What even to call these people is not a simple matter. Contemporaries sometimes called them the disaffected or trimmers. In much subsequent writing on the revolution, they frequently get lumped in with the population of loyalists. But this reflects patriot propaganda more than it does the people in the middle's self-understanding or their lived experiences. The fact that there is no widely shared single name for these people illustrates the continuing conceptual hold that the binaries of patriot and loyalist have on scholarly and popular histories of the revolution. Adopting and adapting the language of Brahman's article, I call these people nobody men, nobody women, and nobodyists. The nobodyists were people affected by the American Revolution who were neither ardent patriots nor committed loyalists, but identifiable through their actions as differing from both the warring parties between 1775 and 1783. This is the deliberately open-ended and inclusive definition of nobody men. I intend to distinguish these people from patriots and especially loyalists, and I use the term to suggest a more flexible, less binary way of considering people's attitudes, behavior, and experiences in the period. The nobodyists were not united by adherence to a single, all-encompassing ideological position. Instead, as patriots and loyalists were, the nobodyists were motivated by a wide range of factors, including understandings of the common good and self-interest, attachments to family and other groups, fear and other emotions, moral and religious attitudes and affiliations, political principles, and many other factors. A starting point for my work is the acknowledgement that the American Revolution was a civil war. Considerable recent scholarship has argued that the American Revolution should be understood as such a conflict, and this provides a key platform for analyzing nobody men's and nobody women's experiences. Writing some 50 years ago, the historian John Shai laid out a basic reason for considering it as such. The American Revolution was a civil war, he wrote, because in proportion to population, almost as many Americans were engaged in fighting other Americans during the Revolution as did so during the Civil War of the 19th century. Although these dimensions were long underanalyzed in nationalist narratives, the conflict was bitter and often ugly. Violence and the threat of violence formed the backdrop to many nobodyists' choices. Framing the American Revolution as a civil war certainly puts the focus on the experiences of the conflict itself, rather than why it happened or what it wrought, but calling the American Revolution a civil war is compatible with seeing what took place in North America between 1775 and 1783 as a radically transformative revolution or a more contained war for independence with less far-reaching implications for Americans and Britain's lives. In this respect, it's useful to heed reminders like the historian David Armige's that every great revolution is a civil war, and Alan Taylor's that, quote, revolutions breed civil wars, triangular struggles in which two sides compete for civilian support. The American Revolution also fits contemporary social scientific definitions of a civil war. One such definition describes civil war as, quote, armed combat within the boundaries of a recognized sovereign entity between parties subject to a common authority at the outset of hostilities. Such definitions are agnostic about both the causes and outcomes of civil wars, which have historically occurred for many different reasons and ended with widely varying types of settlements. Whether we think of the American Revolution as a civil war because Americans fought Americans, or because it involved war between subjects of the sovereign entity that was the British Empire, it's clear that the conflict was something other than a national, interstate conflict between Americans and Britons, even if that idea continues to have a powerful hold on our imaginations. One productive outcome of putting the American Revolution into dialogue with other civil wars across world history is that it highlights the prevalence of neutrals, people in the middle, nobodyists in such conflicts. As a leading comparative social scientific study of civil wars has put it, quote, an empirical regularity supported by considerable evidence is that only a small minority of people are actively involved in civil wars, either as fighters or active supporters. Despite their numbers, though, nobodyists can be hard to find in the historical record of the American Revolution. Neither warring side thought they should exist, and both used a variety of pressures: military service, oaths, violence, and the threat of violence, to force unwilling people in the middle into their camps. Consequently, during the war, many nobodyists tried to minimize their contact with British and nascent American officialdom alike. Uncovering these people's attitudes, motivations, and behaviors can be difficult because they deliberately avoided revealing their preferences. Silence was a strategy. Moreover, after the war was over, the histories of nobodyists were inconvenient, both for the changed societies in North America, Britain, and the British Empire that emerged from the Revolution, and for former nobodyists themselves. After 1783, staunch loyalists and patriots alike were rewarded with compensation, pensions, land grants, and influence by the political entities that emerged from the Revolution. There were no such incentives for having been a nobodyist. As befitting a large and diverse group of people, nobodyists had widely varying motivations and behaved in different ways. The way that I approach the often obscure history of neutrals in my book is through the ocean-spanning story of a single extended family. I choose to write about them because I think their collective history reveals important, understudied, and recurring themes in the history of neutrality in the Revolutionary era. That family is the Crugers, a merchant clan based in New York that had strong ties to a number of other places, including England and the multinational Caribbean. The founding male member of this family, the first John Cruger, was an immigrant from Northern Europe. He was possibly Dutch or German by birth, and he was working as a maritime trader in New York City by the 1690s. He grew wealthy and well-known, in part thanks to his marriage to Maria, a New York-born member of the influential Cuyler family. His trading business was taken up by their sons in the family's second generation. Henry Cruger Sr. and his brother John Cruger formed a very large, long-running business partnership, and they built up a prosperous general trading firm from the 1730s on. By the 1760s, this second generation had been joined in business by the family's next generation, Henry's sons, the brothers John Harris Cruger, Henry Jr., Nicholas, and Telamon. They fanned out across the Atlantic in search of commercial opportunities while continuing to do much business with each other and with New York. Henry Jr. was learning his trade in Bristol, England by 1757, while his brothers took on representing family interests in the Caribbean. In around 1765, John Harris was based in Jamaica, Telamon in Curacao, and Nicholas in St. Croix. As the oldest brother, John Harris returned back to New York City in the late 1760s and gradually began filling his father's shoes at the hub of the family's circumatlantic trading network. The Crugers bought, sold, and shipped just about anything on which they thought they could turn a profit. They exchanged foodstuffs, timber, and other continental produce for the sugar, molasses, and rum of the West Indies. They traded colonial commodities for British manufactures. They owned and traded in enslaved people at times, and, like many colonial merchants, they likely engaged in smuggling of various types when it suited their interests. They also invested in land and property development in New York City and elsewhere. The most striking example of this was the work that Henry Cruger Sr. did to build and develop Kruger's Wharf on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Begun in the late 1730s as a large L-shaped wooden wharf where ships could be loaded and unloaded, it, like other parts of the Manhattan shoreline, was eventually filled in, creating a substantial new piece of land that the Crugers and their business partners were able to build upon and sell or rent off. Crugers Wharf became the center of the family's commercial operations, busy with the loading and unloading of their own ships and those of other merchants, and ultimately home to an array of buildings and businesses, including warehouses, shops, taverns, and even eventually one of New York's first theaters. The first John Cruger began a tradition of family involvement in municipal politics, serving as a long-time alderman representing New York City's Dock Ward, and capping his career by serving 5 years as New York's mayor before his death in 1744. Politically, in the pre-war period, his descendants were supporters of the colonial cause, Whigs and patriots in the language of the day. And this is well illustrated by this member of the family. His son, the second John Cruger, was a popular mayor of New York City also. He served during the 7 Years' War. He was an effective opponent of the Stamp Act and a longtime New York assemblyman, ultimately serving as the final speaker of New York's colonial legislature. In New York, the Crugers were known as prominent supporters of the colonial cause in disputes with Britain, as promoters of trade and New York City's economic development, and also as active members of the Delanceyite faction in New York's rough-and-tumble provincial politics. This John, in part because of his age and his pre-war reputation, was able to ride out the war years relatively quietly, retiring in 1775 from New York City to the less turbulent confines of the Hudson River town of Kinderhook, with which the Cruger family long had connections. His brother, Henry Cruger Sr., served as a New York provincial councilor in the pre-war years, resigning that office in 1773. Henry's eldest son, John Harris Cruger, who actually became a militant loyalist and was not a nobodyist during the war, followed his father in the office of being a provincial councilor in New York and served in that capacity at the start of the war. In 1775, as war clouds gathered over New York City, Henry Cruger Sr. sailed to Bristol, England, where his son Henry Jr. was already living, and Henry Sr. died there in 1780. The third generations of Crugers built on this tradition of family participation in local politics in New York and elsewhere in the Atlantic world, where they advocated for freer trade and the rights of colonists like themselves. In the pre-war years in New York, England, and elsewhere, the Crugers were leading figures in the colonial resistance movement, transatlantic Whigs and patriots in the eyes of their contemporaries. But when the shooting started in April 1775, the Crugers made different choices than some of their today more famous pre-war allies. Together, the Crugers had a remarkable and revealing revolution. Most of them became nobodyists, and my book explores their collective and individual paths into, through, and beyond the war years as ways to get at the phenomenon of nobodyism, to get at nobodyists' varied motivations and behaviors, and the ramifications of their wartime choices. Part of my argument is that different members of the family illustrate different varieties of nobodyism. And I'd be happy to discuss different members of the family in the Q&A. But what I'd like to do with the time that I have remaining today is to talk in a bit more detail about one particular branch of this family history, the career of Henry Cruger Jr. And through this, to give you an introduction to how members of the extended Cruger family reveal interesting aspects of Neutral's experiences. So let me now turn and focus for a few minutes on the career of Henry Cruger Jr. I think he's a revealing example of what I call peace-first nobodyism. This was a stance that viewed the Civil War of the Revolution as a tragedy first and foremost, one where the costs were simply much greater than the stakes. Henry was not apathetic or timid. He was immersed in transatlantic politics. His position was that he favored ending the war as quickly as possible. And crucially, this meant that he consistently prioritized achieving peace as more important than the details of any possible political settlement. This led some of his contemporaries to regard him as vacillating or disloyal, but if his prioritization of peace as his fundamental commitment is understood, I think it provides a better way to understand his political choices. Having been sent by his father as a young man to learn his trade in England, Henry settled in the town of Bristol, where in 1765 he married Ellen Peach, the daughter of a linen merchant and banker, Samuel Peach. In the wake of his marriage, aided by his father-in-law, Henry began building up his political interest in his adopted city. He became a member of Bristol's Common Council in 1766, proving popular among both the city's merchants and its proudly independent artisans, who as freemen of the city wielded influence in its politics. In 1766, as his relatives and others were deeply involved in protesting the Stamp Act in New York, he was part of a delegation of Bristol merchants that traveled to London to register their objections to that very controversial law. Alongside Samuel Peach, Henry was also closely associated with Wilkesite oppositional politics in the late 1760s and early 1770s. As with other patriots on both sides of the Atlantic, this radical position insisted upon Englishmen's rights, and this often merged with antipathy to ministerial policy toward America. Cruger chaired, for example, a boisterous July 1769 meeting at the Bristol Guildhall that produced a petition in favor of a more conciliatory policy toward America, a meeting at which Cruger noted that he also shared with many in the crowd a sense of grievance at, quote, the numberless persecutions and cruelties committed against the person of Mr. John Wilkes. Cruger was part of a delegation that presented this petition, which mixed general complaints about ministerial malfeasance with more specific references to Wilkes and America to the king in 1770. In 1774, the British Prime Minister Lord North labeled Cruger, quote, a hot Wilkite, and it was his interlinked support for Wilkes, democratic reform, merchant interests, and American grievances that provided the contours for Cruger's entry into national politics. Cruger's political influence is the product of his transatlantic mercantile connections, but the rise of the non-importation movement in the colonies from the mid-1760s badly hurt his trade. By the summer of 1772, he described himself as distressed for the want of money more than ever man was. In 1773, Cruger traveled back to New York for a prolonged visit of 14 months, probably intended to address his financial difficulties. It also gave him an opportunity to observe the tumultuous colonial political scene firsthand and to connect with patriots in the colonies, including his friend William Palfrey, who was a member of the Sons of Liberty in Boston and, like Cruger, an admirer of John Wilkes. People on both sides of the Atlantic knew that a parliamentary election was in the offing, and even while he was in America, Cruger was already the leading choice of Bristol's radicals to be a candidate for Parliament when the next election was held. When a general election was called after Cruger's return to Bristol in 1774, Cruger and one of the most famous politicians of 18th century Britain, Edmund Burke, were put forward by different groups of backers as opposition candidates for Bristol's 2 parliamentary seats. Their opponents were the borough's incumbent pro-ministerial MPs. The election was hotly contested, but after 23 days of voting, Cruger, who finished first in the poll, and Burke were elected. While they shared an antipathy toward recent American policies, Cruger's personal and political relations with Burke were poor. Cruger had much stronger local connections in Bristol than Burke did, but Burke, who had been an MP since 1766, and was a prominent Rockingham Whig, cut a much larger national figure. Overlapping connections to New York also complicated their relationship. Cruger was deeply tied to the colony of his birth and to the American cause in transatlantic constitutional disputes, but he had no official standing in England with regard to New York or America. Burke served as the paid London agent of the New York Assembly between 1771 and 1775. However, Cruger became increasingly critical of Burke's performance in this role, thinking that Burke too often subordinated New York's interests to those of the Rockingham Whig faction and their hopes to gain control of the British government. Most tellingly, in a debate that resonated widely, Burke and Cruger also disagreed profoundly over the role of an MP. Cruger held that an MP should act as the direct representative of the particular and local interests of his constituents, while Burke, in a very famous political formulation, argued that an MP had a responsibility to exercise his own judgment on the part of the wider nation. Cruger served in Parliament for the next 6 years, that is, during 1774 to 1780, where he was most engaged in trying to end the American War. Elected just before the fighting started and anxious to be seen as a moderate, he feared Lord North had been wrongly led to believe, quote, "I am all gunpowder," and hoping to steer North's government towards a less hardline approach, Cruger adopted an independent stand in Parliament. In his maiden speech before Parliament in December 1774, a moment of real tension in transatlantic relations, Cruger referred to himself as, quote, "an American," when he characterized North's attempts to coerce the colonies as inhumane and contrary to British interests. The 1775 outbreak of open warfare complicated matters considerably for Cruger. Nevertheless, Cruger continued to serve in the British Parliament as British military operations in America expanded, the bloodshed increased, and ultimately, after the Declaration of Independence was issued. He consistently opposed the ministry's pursuit of the war, but if any of these developments made him question remaining within the Parliament, he never showed that openly. In November 1775, both he and his father, Henry Cruger Sr., freshly arrived from New York, met with Lord North to consult on policy toward the now openly rebellious colonies. The Crugers advocated for the dispatching of a delegation of sympathetic British politicians to the colonies to hold talks, but their suggestions came to nothing. In February 1776, Cruger spoke in scathing terms about ministerial policy toward America, but argued that, quote, "the breach is not yet irreparable." While repeatedly urging an end to hostilities and willing to support any plan that aimed at doing so, Cruger was publicly opposed to American independence until at least 1780, when he finally acknowledged that it had become a necessity because it was the best way now to secure peace. Because finding a speedy route out of the war was Cruger's focus, between 1775 and 1783, he associated with people holding a variety of political opinions and engaged in activities not easily categorizable as either patriot or loyalist. While he had long supported the causes of trade and liberty and was invested in the constitutional, economic, and other structures that might come out of the armed conflict, his nobodyism rested on a belief that any practicable post-war arrangements were better than continued fighting. He was consistently willing to support any proposal that might lead to a ceasefire, no matter who proposed it. As he put in a parliamentary speech in 1775, "I pant after peace between this country and its colonies, and will gladly join my feeble voice to any proposal or overture that tends to an amicable settlement of the dispute." This gave him a willingness to engage with politicians in and out of government, and even at times and in circumstances that remain obscure, to share information from his American context with British government officials who were waging war. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this stance also led people on both warring sides to repeatedly suspect his motivations and to question his loyalties. The middle for Henry Cruger became an increasingly lonely place, and neither he nor a small group of other peace-first politicians in England were ever able to find a negotiated way out of the war during the 6 years that he served in Parliament. Cruger may or may not have been correct in his political assessments. As I also discuss in my book, he was no consistent exemplar of virtue. But particularly because his political career entailed a revealing series of choices as the war unfolded, his experiences capture some of the little understood principles, dilemmas, and compromises that were integral to the transatlantic history of appeased first nobodyism. In the 1780 parliamentary elections, both Cruger and Burke were voted out of their Bristol seats. France's entry into the war and independence having become the goal of Americans meant that sympathy for the American cause in Bristol was less powerful than it had been at the war's outset. Cruger himself claimed, quote, he was turned out because of his attachment to the Americans during the war. Burke and Crugers' mutual unwillingness to cooperate also helped ensure that two ministerial candidates were elected. The death of one of these newly elected MPs necessitated a by-election in 1781, which Cruger also unsuccessfully contested. Kruger's American birth and sympathies featured very prominently in campaign materials produced by his opponents in these contests. Here, for example, is a political cartoon in which Cruger, he's in the cart, is depicted as riding in a cart pulled by American supporters of rebellion. As the devil whispers in Kruger's supporters' ears, they trample on the crown and on the scales of liberty. As Cruger speaks words supporting independence, he is followed riding on a bull by an American sailor. In 1774, Kruger's strong American ties were not a substantial electoral liability, but by the early 1780s, positions had hardened considerably. At the same time, pre-war allies in America regarded Kruger's slow and reluctant support for the United States independence as a sign that he was not really a true friend. By 1780, Cruger was considered too pro-American by many in Britain and too pro-British by many in America. Kruger's career, however, was to have two more remarkable acts. The first was a comeback in British politics. Just to give you a sense of how kind of influential he was in his own day. You previously saw a portrait by George Romney. This is a portrait by the great painter of American patriots, Gilbert Stuart. Despite losing the 1781 by-election, he was quickly chosen as mayor of Bristol. As mayor, he remained steadfast in his opposition to the North Ministry's American politics, participating in a 1781 Bristol meeting that produced a petition to Parliament, quote, against the further prosecution of the American war, and that advised a change in the ministry. In 1784, even more remarkably, he secured a return to Parliament as MP for Bristol, this time coming in as a supporter of William Pitt. Henry traveled to America soon after the formal securing of peace in 1783 in an attempt to revive his trade, and he was actually present in America during the entirety of the 1784 election campaign in Bristol. So he had people stand in for him in the 1784 campaign in Bristol because he was in New York. Rather remarkably, Henry Cruger Jr. was present in New York City when the British Army finally evacuated the city in 1783. Even more strongly than in 1780 and 1781, Kruger's opponents in 1784 emphasized his American birth, his financial interests, and pro-American politics, contrasting these traits with their own unambiguous Englishness and loyalty. The polling in 1784 lasted 5 full weeks, and Kruger secured a seat by the narrowest of margins. He defeated the third-place finisher, an old rival, the incumbent George Daubeny, by only 68 votes. Losers of close parliamentary elections in this period often contested the results through petitions to the House of Commons, and Daubeny duly sought to overturn the result of the polling. Charges of corruption were very common in these English petitions, and Daubeny made them in 1784. More uniquely, though, Daubeny also claimed that Kruger should be deemed ineligible because he had become an American citizen on his recent trip to New York. Daubeny's petition asserted that Kruger had taken, prior to the Bristol election, quote, an oath or oaths of allegiance to the said United States or to one or more of them, and thereby did, quote, renounce his allegiance to his majesty and this country and the government thereof. The origins of these charges were probably pseudonymous letters that appeared in the Bristol press during the election campaign. They accused Kruger of having taken an oath of allegiance to the United States in New York just after it was evacuated by the British, and more vividly of, quote, tearing down at New York the royal standard of poor old England with his own hands, and with the same erecting the 13 stripes. He was motivated to take these oaths, these letters claimed, by his political inclinations and by a desire to preserve his ownership of property in now independent New York. All these charges were probably spurious. Kruger's supporters explicitly denied these scandalous claims and challenged the most specific versions of them in print. Kruger, in fact, took up his seat upon the opening of the new session of Parliament in 1784, and Daubney's petition was heard and rejected ultimately in 1786. Crugers' second term in Parliament was quieter than his first, but he continued to act as a friend to America and a zealous advocate for Bristol's commercial interests. In a 1785 debate, he urged Parliament to do everything it could to encourage trade with the now independent United States, and insisted, no doubt with recent accusations in mind, that he spoke, quote, as a merchant whose attachment was to Great Britain alone. Cruger was most prominent during this second period in Parliament in 1789, when he opposed early efforts by William Wilberforce and his allies to abolish British slave trading. Like many Bristol and American merchants, Cruger, some of his New York relatives, and his father-in-law Samuel Peach had all invested in slave trading voyages at various points. When Wilberforce brought in his abolition bill, Cruger presented petitions from 6 Bristol bodies opposing it. In the ensuing debate, Cruger argued that any abolition of slave trading should occur gradually, and he warned that large compensation would be owed to the merchants and planters that were hurt by it. Cruger had long argued that an MP's primary responsibility was to act as the particular representative of the people who had elected him, and his position was very popular in slave trading Bristol, which long remained a center of anti-abolitionist politics. Despite his return to English politics and long residence in Bristol, it's clear that Cruger retained strong financial and emotional connections to his birthplace. In 1788, Cruger wrote to his brother-in-law that, quote, my heart still cleaves to New York. This set the stage for a final twist. Cruger's finances never recovered from the downturn in trade associated with the war. By 1789, he was asking Pitt to appoint him as British consul to the United States, which he said would tend to rescue me and a large family from great difficulties. Unable to obtain this post, Henry took a remarkable but not unique decision in the aftermath of Revolution. As his term of in Parliament ended in 1790, he immigrated, after more than 30 years living in England, back to New York. He never again traded on the scale that he had done in England, but unabashed by his previous history, he quickly entered New York politics. In 1792, his name appeared alongside other prominent New Yorkers who were publicly supporting John Jay for governor. In the same year, he himself was elected to the state Senate as a Federalist, relying heavily on votes from New York City, with whose electors his family had long been connected. Henry was elected over the objections of opponents who challenged both his citizenship and his political role during the Revolution. It has been claimed that Cruger was elected a state senator with, quote, without, quote, ever having renounced his allegiance to the king, but he definitely did so to take up his seat. He and other newly elected senators took, quote, the oath of abjuration and allegiance as required by the laws of this state, and also the oath to support the Constitution of the United States on the first day of New York's new Senate session. If this was the moment when Cruger finally decided once and for all whether he was an American citizen or a British subject, it's remarkable that his revolution and all the questions about loyalty that it raised lasted until 1792. He served just one term as a state senator, declining to stand for re-election in 1796. Some in Bristol continued to remember him fondly. An 1812 campaign song there urged electors to, quote, remember the golden days of honest Harry Cruger, when Bristol's independent sons broke the fetters of coercion. Cruger remained quietly living in New York until his death in 1827. So, having given you an example of how I think the history of the extended Cruger family can help us to think about the dilemmas and experiences of wartime nobodyists, let me conclude. My work on nobodyism and the Crugers is intended as a contribution to what I hope will become an expanding field of neutralist studies. Collectively, neutralist studies should grow to encompass the varied yet connected histories of the diverse individuals and groups caught up in the American Revolution whose experiences of it are obscured rather than illuminated by trying to categorize them as patriots or loyalists. Nobodyism, like patriotism and loyalism, cut across and intersected with the dynamics of gender, race, class, and geography in early America and beyond in the period after 1775. Further explorations of these dynamics will will make our collective understanding of the American Revolution richer, more compelling, and I think ultimately more human. The American Revolution begins to look different once we acknowledge that neither Whigs nor Tories had a monopoly on the truth, and that diverse groups of people sought to chart other paths through the conflict. Thanks very much, and I look forward to questions.
We have a few minutes for questions, so I ask if you do have a question to please raise your hand. It is a very full house, so I will also ask that you keep your comments and questions relatively brief so we can address as many people as possible. It's on.
So, my turn. So, I would guess there'd be a preponderance of Quakers within this group. Am I right?
So it's a great question, a particularly appropriate one for here in Philadelphia. Quakers are the most famous example of this, but in terms of the total population of nobodyists across what becomes the United States, Quakers are a very small part of it. They're very prominent in their neutrality, and they're often held up as the exemplars of it. They're particularly important in Philadelphia and eastern Pennsylvania. But the Quakers are a very small group in terms of the total population of early America. Most people who were neutral were not Quakers, although the Quakers were kind of a prominent part of that population.
First of all, thank you. This was quite good. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
I'm interested in the term neutralist because neutralists are against the Patriot side, they're against the British side, but it doesn't mean they're not for something.
That's right.
And I'm looking at Kruger and trying to figure out exactly what he represents in terms of being for as a neutralist. Peace first, not in the peace sense that Quakers are, not as a pacifist, but peace because it's bad for business, it's bad for England. Tell me a little bit more about how you see Kruger as a man of, if not principle, at least position.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think the reason why I prefer for the whole category this concept of nobodyism rather than neutralist is that neutralist actually, I think, implies, as you say, a particular political position in favor of something. Some nobodyists don't really want to get engaged at all. Kruger is not one of those people. He's a peace-first person. And why is he in favor of sort of peace-first? Well, it very much comes out of his position as a transatlantic trader, although it also speaks to the interests of his constituents who are from a trading town and whose business is intimately connected with America. And this isn't just rich people. Many of his supporters are poorer, middling sorts of people, sailors, artisans whose livelihoods depend on transatlantic trade. They are badly hurt by the American Revolution. And so his interests in some ways align with those of his constituents. That's why he's a kind of popular politician in Bristol. He sees the war as also disastrous for Americans. I mean, he remains very heavily invested in New York. He has a vision of a future, at least at the start of the war, in which New York will do better if it remains part of the British Empire. He wants the constitutional arrangement changed between New York and Britain. He wants more local control for New York. It's a major thing that his family wants. But they don't want to sever that relationship entirely. So they want an altered, not torn, imperial constitution. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Affy. You took my question. I was wondering the same thing. Great talk. I feel like nobodyism is basically human history and warfare. Like most people do not really care. They just want to provide for their family. And history is the extremists, whether heroes or villains. My question had to do with the other flavors of nobodyism, particularly if you have any information from the female members of his family. I'm really interested to see what the other variations of it are.
Yeah, so thank you. It's a great question. So one of the challenges in the project that my talk is based on is that I know much more about the men in their family than I do the women. So that I should be really clear about that. If I can show you, though, I'll just go back to this genealogy because it's a little helpful to talk about this way. A really interesting other example of a different kind of flavor of nobodyism is the experiences of Peter von Schack and Elizabeth Kruger von Schack, so their marriage. She is the sister of Henry Kruger, who I was just speaking about. And they are examples of what I call conscientious objection Conscientious objection is not a term that existed in the time of the American Revolution, so it's kind of applying that back. But they basically, and this is clearer in Peter's case than it is in Elizabeth's case, I should say. But Peter refuses a number of oaths. He refuses to participate in the war effort for either side. He does so after doing a kind of like dream reading for historians. He says, I read Locke and Montesquieu, and I thought about what they said, and I decided I cannot participate in this war. But I'm not going to take any steps to personally oppose it either. He suffers incredibly heavily for this. Elizabeth dies of infectious disease in 1778. How we relate that exactly to the history of the Revolution is complicated. She is one of many civilians who die of infectious disease along with the kind of turmoil of the war. Peter is banished by New York's revolutionary government. He spends 6 years in exile in England, and he always wants to return to New York. He is ultimately able to do so after the war, largely because he hadn't made himself sort of odious to New York's patriot leaders, including an old family friend, John Jay, who really facilitates his return. So that's another example. The last one I'll just highlight is the experience of Nicholas Crugers on the left of this chart. He's an example of what I would think of as self-interested nobodyism. He's a merchant. He's based in St. Croix. He trades with both sides. He's very slippery character. He moves between enemy lines lots of times during the war. And so that's why I think there are kind of a few different expressions of this kind of nobodyism. Thank you.
So I had a question about, well, I wanted to comment on Henry von Skok, his brother, who was another conscious, but who was what I call an oath-taking neutralist. In other words, and I don't know if Peter actually had taken an oath under the British Constitution, but Henry had.
Just keep it slightly closer.
And so anyway, that's just a comment on a small group of people that run across all the colonies who have taken oaths and are conscientious. Then there's a gigantic group, which is Baptists in New England, in Massachusetts particularly, I know about, and then across the South, there are a lot. I wonder if you handle this enormous group of people who vacillate and hold back a lot. Michael McConnell wrote about them about Virginia, kind of a vast group of people who are disengaged. They may get engaged when they're pressed to at the very end, but I wonder how you handle them.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. On the southern population, I would say you're absolutely right. I think that population becomes particularly recognizable to historians in part because of the nature of the war in 1779, 1780, 1781 in the southern backcountry. I get at their story a little bit in my book because John Harris Cruger, the eldest son of the family's third generation, is the one who is not a nobodyist. He is a militant loyalist, and he becomes a soldier, a volunteer loyalist soldier in a unit called Delancey's Brigade, and he sees incredibly brutal fighting. He participates in this warfare in the South and is engaged in pressuring nobodyists, just like his patriot opponents are, to join one side or the other. So this is really savage fighting, rounds of oath-taking, pressing people into militias, atrocities by both sides. He is sort of immersed in that world. So there are lots of people in different places. You mentioned also New Englanders. I would also just say there are Native American communities that are very much try to be in the middle in various ways, sometimes with really disastrous results for their own histories. I think also this concept can be really helpful in thinking through the decisions that African American people made about whether to align at various moments with one side or the other at different times, and to understand their motivations and their kind of pursuit of their own happiness during the war years.
Yeah, just I may not have heard all your comments, but I think you referred a little bit to slavery. Were there clear positions that nobodyists took with regard to slavery?
Thanks for the question. The answer is that nobodyists differed on all sorts of issues, including on slavery. Quakers, prominent nobodyists, were among the most important articulate opponents in many cases of slavery, but other people like the Crugers were very comfortable with slavery and in fact involved in slave trading and slave ownership. So I think there's a huge variety of positions, just like there are among patriots and loyalists, I should say. Thank you.
And our last question is right here.
Thank you for this.
Just hold it close.
Thank you for this talk.
Could you say something about the beginning of your research? I may be the only person in this room who's never heard of the Kruger family. They're clearly an important family. Is there a great catch of letters and documents and manuscripts and diaries that you've come across that no one else knew about, that I didn't know about?
I wish. I wish that was the case. You know, I first got interested in actually because I was talking to a colleague about my interest in this topic of people who are neutral. I hadn't figured out exactly what I thought about it yet, and I was trying to find people that it might be interesting to study this through. He told me about Henry Kruger Jr., and he said, this guy is interesting. You might check him out. And I did, and then I realized that the stories of many other people in his family were also interesting, especially the stories of Peter and Elizabeth von Schack. And so that was sort of a first entry into it, and ultimately I decided that I could see a way to write a book about this topic through this extended family history. Their letters are not in a single repository. That's part of why they haven't been written about a lot. They're scattered, though, in lots of other places.
Well, please thank our guest speaker again, Travis Glasson, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you for all coming out on this snowy afternoon to the American Philosophical Society. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.